She thought her life was over, until a lunch with Morgan Freeman changed everything. At a quiet corner of Lafayette Park, an old man sat on a worn wooden bench, unwrapping his sandwich. Across from him, a homeless woman, wrapped in layers of tattered clothing, hesitated before accepting the half he offered. To everyone else, he was just another old man. But he was Morgan Freeman, and today, this simple lunch would change everything. If you believe respect isn't measured by wealth, comment 1. If you think money determines worth, comment 0. Morgan Freeman was a man who had dined in the finest restaurants, at tables set with crystal glasses and silver cutlery. Yet he sat here, on an old wooden bench in Lafayette Park, sharing a sandwich with a woman the world ignored. Her name was Clara. At least that's what she had told him a few weeks ago, the first time he had sat beside her. She never asked for money, never begged, but every day Morgan came back, and every day he sat beside her. "You're back again," Clara murmured, eyeing the sandwich in his hand. "And you're still here," Morgan replied with a gentle smile, offering her half. Clara hesitated, just like she always did. Pride, even in struggle, is a stubborn thing. Finally, she took it. Morgan took a bite of his half and leaned back. "You ever think about getting off this bench?" he asked casually. Clara let out a low laugh, shaking her head. "You think it's that easy?" Before Morgan could respond, a voice cut through the air. "Hey, old man, what are you doing wasting food on her?" A businessman in a pressed suit sneered at Clara, looking at her like she was less than human. Morgan's expression didn't change, but Clara's hands trembled slightly as she held the sandwich. "Sir," Morgan said slowly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that could silence a room. "You just made the biggest mistake of your day." The businessman in the suit scoffed, shaking his head in disgust. "People like her don't deserve handouts," he muttered as he strode past, adjusting his cufflinks like he had just walked away from something unworthy of his time. Clara froze, sandwich still in her hands. She had heard words like that before, more times than she could count. But this time someone else had heard it too. Morgan Freeman set his sandwich down. "People like her," he repeated, his voice as steady as ever, but with a sharpness that made the air around them feel heavier. The businessman hesitated, sensing the shift in tone, then chuckled dismissively. "Come on," he said, rolling his eyes. "You're Morgan Freeman, aren't you? You don't need to sit here with her. You belong somewhere better." Morgan let out a quiet hum, tilting his head slightly. "Better?" The businessman gestured around them as if the answer was obvious. "This is a park bench, Mr. Freeman. You're a legend. You should be in some five-star restaurant, not sitting next to—" He waved vaguely toward Clara. Morgan leaned forward. "Do you know what makes a place better?" he asked. The businessman frowned, not expecting a challenge. "A better place," Morgan continued, "is one where people remember that kindness is not a privilege, but a choice." The businessman's smirk faltered. Clara, who had been staring at the ground, lifted her head. The businessman muttered something under his breath and walked away. But Morgan wasn't watching him anymore. He was watching Clara. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then slowly, she exhaled. "That happen often?" Morgan asked, picking up his sandwich again. Clara hesitated, then shrugged. "More than you'd think," she said lightly, though there was a weight behind her voice. Morgan nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "And yet, you never say anything back," he observed. Clara let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "What's the point?" she muttered. "I could tell them I used to be a teacher, that I lost my home after my husband passed, that I don't drink, don't steal, don't hurt anybody, and it wouldn't matter." She glanced at Morgan, her expression unreadable. "Because all they see is this." She gestured to herself, the worn coat, the tangled hair, the tired eyes. Morgan was quiet for a moment. Then he set his sandwich down again, brushing his hands together. "You know what I see?" Clara blinked. "I see someone who still has pride," Morgan said. She scoffed. "Pride doesn't mean much when you're sleeping on a bench, Mr. Freeman." "Maybe," he admitted, "but it means you're still holding on to something." He studied her for a moment, then smiled slightly. "And I like eating lunch with people who still have something left to fight for." For the first time since they met, Clara had no idea what to say. The next day, Morgan returned to the same park bench, and so did Clara. She didn't ask why he was there. He didn't ask why she came back. They just ate, talked, sat in silence when the conversation ran dry. One day became two became a week, then a month. By now, the people in the park had noticed. Some of them whispered, some took photos from a distance, unable to understand why a Hollywood legend would spend his time with someone like Clara. But Morgan? Morgan didn't care, and neither did Clara. Until one afternoon when Morgan arrived at the bench with something different. A book. He set it down next to her, watching her reaction carefully. Clara stiffened, then gave him a wary look. "What's this?" she asked. "Something I thought you might like," Morgan said casually. She picked it up, running her fingers over the worn cover. Then slowly she opened it. And that was when Morgan saw it. The way her brows furrowed. The way her fingers tightened around the pages. The way she stared, not at the words, but through them. And that was the moment he realized the truth. Clara couldn't read. But what she didn't know was that Morgan Freeman wasn't just here to share lunch. He was here to change her life forever. Clara's fingers tightened around the edges of the book, her knuckles turning white. For the first time since she had met Morgan Freeman, she looked truly uncomfortable. Her usual sarcasm was gone. The easy, lighthearted way she deflected difficult topics. Gone. Morgan had noticed things before. The way she always hesitated when he handed her a newspaper. How she never read the signs around the park, always relying on memory instead. But until now, he had never pushed. Until now, he hadn't realized. "Clara?" he said gently. She swallowed, her grip on the book tightening. Her voice faltered, and for the first time, she didn't meet his gaze. Morgan said nothing. He simply waited. And finally, after a long, heavy silence, she let out a breath and closed the book. "I can't read it." The words came out quieter than he expected. Not defensive, not angry, just matter of fact. Clara placed the book on the bench between them, staring down at it like it was a reminder of something she had spent years trying to forget. "I mean, I can read," she muttered, rubbing a hand over her face. "Sort of. I can make out street signs. Order from a menu, well, sometimes." She let out a bitter laugh. "But anything more than a few sentences?" She shook her head. "I get lost, words jumble together, and after a while I just stop trying." Morgan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "When did that start?" he asked. Clara exhaled sharply, rubbing her hands together. "I never really learned," she admitted. "I left school early to take care of my grandmother. She was sick and it was just us, so I worked instead, and then, when she passed," her voice trailed off. Morgan didn't press, because he already knew how the rest of that story went. She had fallen through the cracks of a system that was never built to catch people like her. And now here she was, stuck. Clara laughed again, shaking her head. "You know what's funny?" she asked, finally looking at him. "People see me sitting out here and think they know everything about me." She gestured vaguely at the park, at the people who walked past her every day without ever really seeing her. "They assume I'm lazy, that I'm here because I screwed up or because I made bad choices. But no one ever asks what really happened. No one ever thinks—" She cut herself off, then sighed. "And honestly, I let them think that. It's easier." Morgan studied her carefully. Then he glanced down at the book sitting between them. "But that's not what you want, is it?" he asked. Clara hesitated. Then quietly she shook her head. "No," she whispered. Morgan picked up the book, turning it over in his hands. "I have a proposal," he said. Clara arched an eyebrow, suspicious. "I don't need charity, Freeman." Morgan chuckled, shaking his head. "Good," he said, "because this isn't charity." He held up the book. "You teach me how to survive out here, how to see the things most people miss." Then he placed it back in her hands. "And I'll teach you how to read." Clara stared at him. Her fingers ran over the book's cover, her expression unreadable. Morgan waited, And then after what felt like an eternity, she exhaled. "Fine," she muttered. "But if you're a bad teacher, I'm charging you for wasting my time." Morgan laughed. "Deal." Clara thought she was just learning to read. What she didn't realize was that Morgan Freeman was about to change her life forever. Clara never expected much from life anymore. She had long accepted that the world moved too fast for people like her, people who had fallen behind. But somehow, in just a few weeks, her mornings had changed. Now every day she waited for the familiar sound of approaching footsteps. And every day Morgan Freeman arrived, book in hand. They started small, basic words, short sentences. Morgan was patient. He never rushed her, never judged. When she struggled, he simply smiled and said, "We'll try again tomorrow." And so they did, day after day. Until one afternoon, something changed. Clara managed to read an entire paragraph out loud. She didn't even realize it until Morgan leaned back, a proud smile on his face. "Told you," he said. "You just needed time." Clara blinked down at the page, her hands trembling. For years, she had convinced herself that she wasn't capable. But now, sitting on a park bench with a Hollywood legend, she was proving herself wrong. And what neither of them realized was that their story was no longer just theirs. It had begun to spread. One afternoon, a passerby stopped and stared. It wasn't unusual for people to recognize Morgan Freeman, but what was unusual was what he was doing. Wait, is Morgan Freeman teaching a homeless woman to read? The man pulled out his phone, a single picture, a short caption, and just like that, the internet took over. By the next morning, the photo had thousands of shares. By the end of the week, millions. It was everywhere. News articles, TV segments, social media pages filled with admiration. People were moved, not just because it was Morgan Freeman, but because it was kindness in its purest form. A legend using his time to help someone society forgot. If a man as busy as Morgan Freeman can do this, what excuse do we have? This is what humanity looks like. The messages flooded in, and soon they weren't just words on a screen. People started asking, how can we help Clara? One morning, Morgan arrived at the park expecting their usual lesson. Instead, Clara sat on the bench, staring at a newspaper article. Her own face stared back at her. From forgotten to inspired, the woman Morgan Freeman refused to overlook. Her hands shook as she held the paper. "I don't understand," she whispered. Morgan chuckled. "You didn't think people would notice?" Clara let out a breathless laugh. "No," she admitted. "Why would they?" Morgan tilted his head. "Because people love a story of hope," he said. She swallowed hard. "Hope," she repeated, the word foreign yet familiar on her tongue. For the first time in years, she felt it. But hope wasn't just a feeling. It was about what came next. And what came next was something Clara never expected. A week later, a stranger approached their bench. She was well-dressed, carrying a leather portfolio. "Ms. Polly," the woman said, her voice warm. Clara stiffened. Nobody had called her that in years. "I read about your story," the woman continued, handing Clara a business card. It belonged to a local literacy program. "We want to help. We'd love to offer you a spot in our adult learning initiative. And if you're interested, a job training opportunity." Clara froze. She wasn't sure she had heard correctly. A program? A job? She looked at Morgan, panic flickering in her eyes. She stammered. "I don't know if I can—" Morgan placed a reassuring hand over hers. "Clara," he said, his voice steady, "you've already proven you can." She inhaled sharply, emotions overwhelming her. This wasn't just a second chance, it was a new beginning. Clara sat frozen on the park bench, the business card resting between her fingers like it was made of glass. A literacy program, a job training opportunity. For years, she had convinced herself that doors like these were permanently shut. Yet here she was, staring at an open one. "You don't have to decide right now," the woman said gently, sensing Clara's hesitation. But Clara wasn't just hesitant, she was terrified, because hope was a dangerous thing when you had spent years living without it. Morgan watched her carefully. He could see it, the way her fingers trembled against the paper, the way she swallowed hard like she was preparing for disappointment before it even came. "You don't think you deserve this, do you?" he asked softly. Clara exhaled sharply, laughing without humor. "I've spent years believing I was invisible," she admitted. "People pass by me every day without a second glance. And now, all of a sudden, people care?" Her grip tightened on the business card. "What happens when they stop caring?" Morgan's gaze didn't waver. "What happens if they don't?" She fell silent, because that was the real question, wasn't it? Not what if I fail, but what if I succeed? The woman from the literacy program gave Clara an encouraging smile. "We'll be here if you're ready," she said, handing her a pamphlet. Then she left, walking away as the weight of the moment settled onto Clara's shoulders. For a long while, she said nothing, just sat there, thinking, daring herself to believe. Morgan let the silence stretch, knowing this was a battle only Clara could fight. Finally, she took a deep breath, and then, slowly, carefully, she turned the business card over in her hands. "I don't even have a phone," she murmured. Morgan smiled. "Then I guess we'll have to fix that first." For the first time in a long time, Clara let herself grin, because for once she wasn't thinking about how far she had fallen. She was thinking about how far she could go. The real test wasn't taking the first step. It was proving she had the strength to keep walking. Clara clutched the business card in her hand like it was a lifeline and a burden all at once. She had spent years telling herself that opportunities like this were for other people, not for a woman who had spent nights sleeping on a park bench, not for someone who had once struggled to read the signs on a cafe menu, not for her. And yet, here she was, standing outside a small community center, staring at the glass doors that could change her life. She wasn't sure if she was more afraid to walk in or to turn away. "You don't have to do this alone." Morgan's voice came from beside her. She inhaled sharply, startled. "I wasn't expecting you to come." "I wasn't expecting you to hesitate," he replied, smiling slightly. Clara let out a shaky laugh, more nervous than amused. "This is insane, right?" she muttered. Morgan tilted his head. "What's insane is thinking you don't deserve a second chance." She exhaled slowly. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she stepped forward, and for the first time in years, she walked towards something instead of running from it. Inside the center, the air was bright, buzzing with energy. People moved through hallways lined with bookshelves, classrooms filled with quiet conversations and nervous laughter. A woman at the front desk smiled warmly. "Clara Polly?" Clara nodded slowly. "We're so happy you're here," the woman continued. "Are you ready for your assessment?" Clara hesitated. "Assessment?" The woman nodded. "We just want to understand where you are so we can tailor the best learning path for you. Nothing to stress about." Easy for her to say. But for Clara? This was the most terrifying thing she had done in years. She followed the woman down a hallway and into a small room with a single desk. A printed test was placed in front of her. "Take your time," the woman encouraged. "We're just here to help." Clara stared at the paper. Words blurred together. Letters twisted, rearranged themselves into something foreign. Her hands started shaking. Her breath quickened. For a brief, terrifying moment, she thought about walking out. She thought about tearing up the test, apologizing, running back to the park where things were familiar, but then she felt it. A presence, steady, unmoving. She looked up and saw Morgan standing outside the door, watching through the small window, not pressuring her, not pushing her, just reminding her that she wasn't alone. She took a breath. She picked up the pencil and she started. The questions weren't impossible. They weren't even as bad as she had feared. But her mind was louder than the test itself. "You're not smart enough." "You don't belong here." "You'll never be good enough." But with every word she read, every sentence she wrote, the voices faded. She was proving them wrong. By the time she set her pencil down, her hands were sweaty, her heartbeat wild in her chest. But she had done it. She had finished. The instructor smiled as she collected the test. "Great job, Clara," she said. "We'll review it and talk about your learning plan soon." Clara nodded, standing up on shaky legs. When she stepped out into the hallway, Morgan was still waiting. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him, eyes bright with something he hadn't seen before. Not fear, not doubt, determination. Morgan smiled. "How do you feel?" Clara let out a breath. "Like I just climbed a damn mountain." "And?" She grinned. "And I want to see what's at the top." She thought passing the test was her victory, but what happened next would be something she never saw coming. Clara had never been more nervous in her life. She had faced cold nights on the streets, the shame of being ignored, the gut-wrenching hunger that clawed at her insides. But nothing, not even those years of struggle, felt as terrifying as what lay ahead. A job interview. It sounded simple enough. People did this every day, but for Clara, this wasn't just about getting a job. It was about proving to herself that she was worth the opportunity, that she wasn't just a charity case, that she belonged. She smoothed her borrowed blouse, her fingers trembling slightly. It was the nicest thing she had worn in years, courtesy of the community center. She barely recognized herself in the mirror before leaving. "You clean up nice," Morgan had teased that morning as he met her outside the park. "I feel like an imposter," she had muttered. Morgan's smile never wavered. "Then it's time to prove yourself wrong." Now, standing outside the cafe where the interview would take place, Clara wasn't so sure. Through the window, she could see the busy restaurant floor, servers balancing trays, customers chatting over coffee, the constant hum of orders being called out. It had been years since she had been inside a workplace. Could she really do this? The moment she walked in, the air felt heavier. The hiring manager, a middle-aged woman named Dana, sat behind the counter flipping through resumes. When she looked up, her expression wasn't unkind, but it wasn't particularly welcoming either. "You must be Clara," Dana said, standing to shake her hand. Clara swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, ma'am." They sat down at a small table near the back. "So," Dana said, glancing at her papers, "I understand you've had some time away from the workforce. Can you tell me a little about your past experience?" Clara exhaled. "Here we go. I worked in restaurants before," she started, "mostly as a prep cook and server." "How long ago?" Clara hesitated. "It's been a while." Dana didn't write anything down, she simply nodded. "And what have you been doing since then?" The word stung. Because how was she supposed to say, "I've been surviving"? How was she supposed to turn years of being ignored, struggling, and barely making it through the day into something that sounded employable? Clara clenched her hands in her lap, suddenly feeling small again. She started, but then froze. And then, from the corner of the cafe, a familiar voice cut in. "She's been learning." Clara turned sharply. Morgan Freeman stood near the entrance, watching. Dana's eyes widened slightly. "Mr. Freeman?" Morgan smiled, stepping forward. "I'm just here as moral support," he said smoothly before looking directly at Clara. "But if you're asking what she's been doing, she's been learning, growing, and fighting for a second chance." Dana glanced between them, clearly trying to process why an Academy Award-winning actor was backing a job candidate. Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. Morgan wasn't answering for her. He was reminding her. She had a story to tell. She took a slow breath. "I've spent the last few months improving my reading," she said, regaining her confidence. "I've been working with a literacy program and rebuilding my skills. I'm not where I want to be yet, but I'm getting there." Dana studied her. "And why do you want this job?" Clara met her gaze head on. "Because I'm tired of surviving," she said. "I want to start living again." Dana was silent for a long moment. Then she set down her papers. "The position starts next week. Can you be here Monday morning?" Clara stared. I got the job?" Dana smiled. "You got the job?" The world around Clara blurred for a second. Everything, the years of struggle, the doubt, the fear, melted away. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was here. She was seen. She had made it. Just when Clara thought her journey was over, fate had one last surprise waiting for her. Clara stood outside the cafe, the crisp job offer in her hands, the weight of it heavier than anything she had carried before. She had come here expecting rejection. She had come here prepared to fail, because failure was familiar. But today, the world had given her something different. A chance. Morgan Freeman stood beside her, watching as she ran her fingers over the paper, as if trying to convince herself that this was real. "You did it," he said softly. Clara let out a small, shaky laugh. "I did." But then she turned to him, her smile fading just slightly. "What if I mess this up?" she whispered. Morgan smiled. "Then you try again." She swallowed hard, the truth of his words settling deep. For the first time in years, she believed in herself. Not because someone had saved her, not because she had been lucky, but because she had fought for this. She had taken the first step. And now, she would keep walking. As they started toward the street, Clara glanced back at the park bench, the place where it had all started, a place where a simple act of kindness had rewritten the story of her life. And as she walked away, she knew she would never sit there again. This wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. Through this story, we realize that kindness isn't just an action. It's a force that can change lives. Morgan Freeman didn't give Clara money. He didn't offer her shortcuts. What he gave her was respect, time, belief. In a world that too often judges worth by wealth and status, this story reminds us that true value is measured by resilience, by determination, and by the willingness to help others rise. Because the greatest power isn't found in money or fame. It's found in lifting someone up until they can stand on their own.